that really brought up this idea that we've talked about with Andy, we've talked about with my dad, we've talked about it with all of us, how we've never seen this before, where a judge brought in somebody who tried to, remember, he never got to that point where so far has not been allowed to yet, tried to bring in a former judge, Judge Gleason, now in private practice, to argue a position that he wanted against the U.S. government and against another party in the case, Mike Flynn. So you have an Obama-appointed judge on the Court of Appeals, Judge Pillard, asked about that to Sidney Powell and whether or not that was, in a sense, did that show that there was some kind of, not that this was not on the disqualifying because he's a party, but that he was no longer impartial. Take a listen, Bite 54.
So Judge Sullivan showed bias by appointing an amicus, but Gleason wasn't being chosen as the judge. He was invited to argue one side in an adversary system. And the adversary system is so that we get the law right. It's the core of any judge's job to assess cases in view of the strongest arguments that can be made on both sides. And your position is, no, he can't hear both sides on the law. He has to drop the case like a hot potato without adversary briefing and argument. That's your position.
There is no provision for amicus in a criminal case in the federal district court, and certainly not to take the position of the government when it has decided to drop the case. When the government signs off, the case is over. The Article 3 branch cannot make the Article 3 branch prosecute a case.
I mean, Sidney is precisely correct. I mean, there should be no real discussion on this point, although there was, because this is a very liberal court these days. But the fact of the matter is this idea that the prosecutors drop the case so the judge, I mean, think about this, the judge appoints a retired judge to serve basically as a special counsel.
Yes, and the judge who asked the question is admitting that, is saying to keep it adversarial, to bring in somebody to argue against the U.S. government and really to try and prosecute, to keep the prosecution going in Mike Flynn. And just to simplify this to people, what Sidney Powell, Mike Flynn's attorney, said is, no, the judge doesn't get to bring in somebody to keep a prosecution going. If the government, if the prosecutors say we're not going to prosecute this anymore, that's it for the judge. The judge has no more role to play. He cannot bring in someone to keep a prosecution going. That's not his role in the Constitution. The fact that this judge, which we knew this court is very liberal, is trying to justify these decisions by Judge Sullivan, when I think even deep down they know it's absurd, but they're trying to justify these decisions, saying, well, why can't they question it? Aren't they want the interest of justice? And Sidney Powell answers with the correct legal argument back, which is there's nothing more to argue in this case because the prosecutors said we're not going to bring charges.
You know, Andy, in the Supreme Court practice that's called confession of error, sometimes a case will go up and the government, it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens, every couple of sessions, the government will now, after looking at the case, will say, we confess error. We should not have brought this case in the first place. And that is the end of the matter. And then Justice Ginsburg wrote a unanimous opinion for the Supreme Court where she said it's the job of the litigants to frame the issue, not the court.
Well, that's true, Jay. Justice Ginsburg said it is not the job of a district judge to sally forth every day looking for wrongs to right. It is the job of the district judge, the trial judge, to umpire proceedings. And Judge Sullivan has overstepped those bounds terribly in this case. He has decided that this prosecution is not going to be over. That's not something that an Article 3 judge has the right to do. He has chosen to pick former Judge Gleason to advocate on behalf of the government. Well, guess what? The government doesn't need an advocate. The government has already decided it doesn't want to prosecute Flynn because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that we have violated Brady and failed to disclose material that could exonerate him. And that is a decision the Attorney General has made. That ends it. You don't bring in another person, or the judge certainly doesn't bring in another person to say, well, let's talk about that. Let's have a little adversarial proceeding and discuss that and see really whether, in fact, the Justice Department is right or wrong. Judge Sullivan has way overstepped his bounds.